Hello, I'm John Hartnett, a sort of retired Episcopal priest, and this is the next in my series of reflections on lessons appointed for Sunday in the Revised Common Lectionary. Today I'll be working with a story from the Gospel according to St. Mark. It's chapter 8, verse 27 to the end of the chapter, and I'll read the Gospel first, and then we'll go into the reflection. Mark 8:27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But, turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The word of the Lord. Well, context. Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, he's been healing, he's been feeding, he's been working miracles, and he's also been hiding. He has gone up to Caesarea Philippi, which is 20 miles inland from Tyre and 20 miles or so north of the Sea of Galilee. It's very close to the springs that form the source of the River Jordan, which has some interesting sort of resonance when we talk about John the Baptist later. It's an area which had become sacred to the Greek god Pan. Water made it fertile. It's far away from Jerusalem. It's back in the North Country. Again, not far from where Jesus grew up. He's back sort of in the hinterlands, not at the center of things. And Jesus checks in with his disciples. And he says, "So, who do people say that I am?" Which is a way of saying, how is this going? Or what message is getting through? What are people making of all this? And they say, well, some say you're like John the Baptist. You're in the wilderness, you're a voice calling out, you're calling people to repent. You're not one of the temple guys. And remember, John was beheaded by Herod. And others say, well, you're like Elijah, the Old Testament prophet. He took on Ahab and he took on Jezebel, bad kings and queen. And he took on the prophets of Baal, pagan gods, up here in the north. He was a worker of wonders, and he was on the run for his life much of the time. His end was mysterious. He is swept up into heaven, leaving Elijah as his successor. And there was this sense of he's going to be coming back, and people think, well, maybe this is Elijah actually come back. People are looking for a familiar reference point to cite to sort of categorize who Jesus is. It reminds me of my early days in the publishing business in New York back in the 1970s, whenever there was a new book coming out, people would say, well, it's the new Jaws, or it's the new, name some bestseller. Because they would want to say, this is a book you haven't seen before, but it's really like a book you already like and know, so buy it on that basis. And it's sort of like, this is the new John the Baptist. This is the new Elijah. Nothing sort of that you can't grasp or understand here. And, jacket blurbs on books are the same way. A famous author will say, hey, read this book. And you think, well, gosh, if, John Grisham thinks it's a good book, then maybe I should read it. It's like, how do we know something new? And Jesus, after asking them to sort of sample the crowd, turns on them and says, well, what do you make of me? I think it's a bit of a pop quiz. Suddenly, it's not what other people think and say, but who do you say that I am? Now, as people who are hearing or reading this story, I think it's appropriate to say, well, if you're in this scene, if you're there walking along with Jesus, what do you say? If someone asks you this week, So, who is Jesus really? How would you reply? Not just what do you think, but what do you actually say? What might help you not just know what to say, I mean, probably most people, oh, Jesus is the Son of God, but to feel comfortable and even confident in actually saying what you think about Jesus and who he is to someone who might ask, and feel like it's an important question and an important answer. Peter blurts out, "You are the Messiah," which means the Christ, the anointed one, the chosen one. Now, Christ is simply the Greek word for anointed one, for which the Hebrew term is Messiah. To say Jesus Christ is actually an affirmation of faith. It is saying that Jesus of Nazareth is not just a compassionate and wise teacher who, like Socrates, lost his life for the sake of his beliefs. To be the Messiah, the Christ, is to have a genuinely unique identity. Christ is not Jesus' last name. So to say, "Oh Christ," or "for Christ's sake," is to invoke the unique and holy one of God. So be careful. And should you hear yourself saying something like that, stop and consider what you have done and whether it's actually a good idea. We shape our character. We shape our world in part by what we say. I mean, in Genesis, God creates the world by saying, "Let there be." And I think in our own words, we also create. We create a mood, we create an atmosphere, we create or ruin a relationship by what we say. One way Christians should be different is we should not use the name or title of the Son of God for anything but a high and holy purpose. They are words for prayer. By calling Jesus the Christ, Peter makes it clear that Jesus is not one of a group or the latest in a series, but the one uniquely chosen by God. Now, when Matthew tells this story, and it's only in Matthew's version, Peter immediately gets a gold star and an attaboy from Jesus. Matthew says, Jesus answered Peter, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." It's an impressive show of Jesus' approval for what Peter just said. Peter, by the way, the Greek word means rock. It's like calling him, okay, you used to be called Simon, now I'm going to call you Rocky. So it's Jesus saying, yes, you got the right answer, and really holding that up in a very impressive way. Mark reports none of that. In Mark's account, no sooner does Peter say, "You are the Messiah," than Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Sternly. Why? Jesus seems not to want to be put into a box. He's not ready fully to go public yet. As he says in the Gospel of John, the way he phrases this is, "My hour is not yet come." Jesus has come to do something more than heal, feed, or work wonders. If feeding or healing were his primary purpose, that's what he would have done. But the miracles are not ends in themselves, but pointers to who he is, and that's the main event. Note that when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" apparently only Peter answers. In the earlier part of the story of this conversation, the text talks about what they said. This time, it's just Peter. And as we've seen, Matthew highlights Peter's response even more. John doesn't have this exact scene, but remember from a few weeks ago when Jesus says, when he talks about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, he says, "Well, do you all want to go now too, because people are rejecting this as being too weird?" And Peter is the one who replies, "Where else could we go? You have the words of eternal life." So that's John's version of saying Peter actually did get this in a way that nobody else seems to have. And Luke, who I think sides with Paul in the Peter versus Paul tension in the early church, Luke completely leaves this positive portrait of Peter and his insight out of his gospel. It doesn't show up in Luke. But in Mark, Jesus gives no ringing endorsement of Peter's declaration. He first says, "Don't tell anyone," says it sternly, and then he goes on to explain what the future will hold. rejection, death, and eventually resurrection. He knows the cost of confronting the establishment for himself, and by extension, for those who follow him. Whoever would follow him would need to take up their own cross and deny themselves. Not just Jesus has his cross, but he says, anybody who follows me is going to have their own version of the cross. Peter, full of himself and riding on the crest of having alone given the right answer to Jesus' question, demurs from Jesus' gloomy prediction. Don't be so negative, he in effect says. We can make this work. Jesus doesn't say, well, that's one way to look at it. He doesn't begin his response by saying something like, I can understand why you might think that, Peter. He doesn't say, well, that might be your truth. He slaps him down with, get behind me, Satan. Peter has gone from head boy to Satan in the blink of an eye. Jesus makes no compromise with fears and feelings when what is at stake is the truth about who he is. Jesus offers the invitation to become part of something larger than ourselves and our immediate self-interest. The paradox is that while the benefit is high, so is the cost, and in some ways the cost comes maybe before the benefit. And the invitation is not just to be part of any good cause, but to become part of the work of God. It might be tempting to use that invitation as justification for imposing our own views or ideology. To say that I am doing something that seems irrational because I believe God has told me to do it sounds very much like an insane person. And yet, if the culture is driven by something other than God, to follow God will make one an outcast or an outlaw in the culture. Winning all of the prizes and accolades of the culture is of no value if they do not give you true life. Is our culture these days offering true life, do you think? How are our leaders this year? People that you particularly admire and think, wow, we are so fortunate to have them at the head of the list. Can we be proud of what we have become? Does it make sense to double down on what has brought us to this point? Jesus actually offers an alternative. True life, Jesus asserts, comes only from God. So if one accepts the invitation to follow Jesus so that one might become more closely aligned to God, what Jesus says and what God says become of the highest importance. In this perspective, bad theology is especially dangerous because it cloaks our own agendas with the power and the authority, the appearance of being approved by God. Bad theology is fraud of the highest order. Lies about God are toxic on every level, and being able to discern what is true about God and what is not is a matter of life and death for individuals and for our larger culture. So where we go to learn of God and by what standards we test any assertions about God and God's will are critical matters for everyone, as indeed would be leaving God out of the conversation, because we've seen where that's taken us. At the end of the gospel, Pilate is in the palace, atop of the pyramid of the culture, and Jesus is on the cross. But who, as it finally turns out, has true life? Who is God's anointed, God's chosen, God's Messiah, God's Christ? Whom will you follow? Who do you say that Jesus is, not only with your lips, but in your life? What will help you in the week to come to become more sure, more confident that Jesus is the Christ? And from that confidence, what might you do to reorder your life to be more in harmony with that understanding of Jesus and of yourself? What might you do or say or not say so that consciously or otherwise, people whom you encounter will sense they have been in the presence of a disciple of the Christ? Who do you say that he is? Thank you.